There were many strange things about Major, the old Labrador, but perhaps the strangest was his nightly ritual of curling up next to the worn brown shoes by the front door. Those shoes had belonged to Frank, Major's owner, who'd passed away several months earlier. At least that's what they told the dog's new owner, Emma. She found it all a bit weird, but she was young and didn't understand the ways of old dogs. So she let it be. Night after night, she'd come home from work to find Major in the same spot, fast asleep with his head resting on the shoes. Sometimes he'd even chew on one of them, but never made a dent in their well-worn leather. It wasn't until one evening that Emma actually saw what happened. She'd come home early from work and hid in the bushes across the street, watching through the front window. There was Major, trotting excitedly by the door when it opened. But instead of greeting her, he nosed around on the floor, then curled up by the shoes. Emma felt a pang of sympathy. Of course, he was just lonely. She knew that look. She got it often enough from her own mother, whose husband had died when she was much younger. When you lose someone you love, there's always a part of you that stays stuck in the past, unable to move forward because something or someone is missing. For the first time, Emma understood why Major would spend so much time by the door. He was waiting for Frank to come back. As the weeks went on, Emma tried to break the habit. She took Major for long walks, played fetch, and hid his favorite squeaky toy under her bed. But every night when she left for work, he went back to his post by the door. Then one day, she had an idea. Emma went out and bought a pair of identical shoes. They weren't the same worn leather, of course, but they were as close as she could get. She placed them by the door, then left for work. That night when she came home, she found Major in his usual spot, but with his head resting on the new shoes. Had he accepted them? Night after night, she watched from the window as Major spent his evenings chewing on the new shoes, occasionally trotting to the door to sniff the air. One night, Emma came home early again, but this time she let herself in through the back door. Quietly, she crept into the kitchen and looked at Major, who was sound asleep with a shoe dangling from his mouth. For a moment, she simply stood there watching him, then gently picked up the shoe. Major stirred and whined softly, then slowly opened his eyes. Seeing Emma standing there with his shoe in her hands, he cocked his head and wagged his tail. She smiled and gave him the shoe back. Major lapped up the treat, then trotted over and nudged her hand with his wet nose. It was the closest he'd ever come to her while awake, and though it was just a friendly gesture, Emma felt a lump forming in her throat. That night, she lay awake in bed, listening to the house. In the quiet, she could hear the soft thud of Major's old heart thumping against his chest. It was probably just a dream, but Emma swore she heard him whimpering. When morning came, she found him by the door, but he was shaking and his eyes were wide and scared. As the day wore on, he grew calmer. But that night when Emma came home from work, she found the shoes by the door were empty. She searched the house for Major, calling his name, but he was nowhere to be found. Then she heard the familiar sound of barking outside. Through the front window, she saw Major trotting excitedly down the street. He was old, and his legs were stiff, but he kept up a good pace. Emma grabbed her coat and ran after him. When she finally caught up, he was standing by the shoes. They were Frank's actual shoes, the ones he'd worn when he took Major on long walks in the park. Emma knelt down beside them and buried her face in Major's thick fur. He didn't understand why the smell of Frank's shoes faded more each day. He didn't understand what death meant. All he knew was that waiting by the door felt right.